everyone. I'm Lisa Pritchard, Director of the Library. This is a PACE event, and it's part of a year-long series we're having in the library leading up to the 250th anniversary of our country. So welcome. Restrooms are around the corner to the right. At this moment, please silence your devices. This presentation will be filmed for later viewing, so just be aware of that. Chris Otto is a professor of English at Jefferson College, and since he was a young boy, he has been fascinated with Native Americans. From 2013 to 2015, he participated in a 3-year National Endowment for the Humanities project titled Native Americans in the Midwest. That experience led him to conduct research on the removal of the Osage from Missouri and Native American legends and other topics. Chris says, as inheritors of a state and a nation created by the choice of our ancestors, he hopes this presentation will result in dialogue and reflection on the memory and legacy of Native Americans in Missouri and across the country. Welcome, Chris Otto.
Thank you. So 250 years of American history, and I start the first slide with a timeline of indigenous presence in the state of Missouri, and it goes back to at least 12,000 years. So I like to think about what we've done in 250 years and what they did in 12,000 years, and I wonder about the way we've treated the land, the way we've treated the water and the air. And there's a fundamental difference when you get into the reading and research, and that is an indigenous person thinks of all of the living things around him or her as a spirit being, and that so you think of the land as a relative, you think of an animal as a relative, and there seems to be a much more extractive mindset from our European background. And so there's even evidence that suggests that maybe at the Big Eddy site, which is in southwest Missouri, they found some evidence that maybe there was human habitation 13,000 years ago. So this might involve rewriting some of our history books that talks about how people came over the land bridge at the end of the last ice age. This is actually predating that. And I believe a couple of years ago, there was some finds at the White Sand National Monument or Park in New Mexico. And there was actually evidence suggesting human habitation like 20,000 years ago. So if you read Native American and indigenous people's legends, their oral tradition says we've always been here. And I think that as time kind of unfolds, we're going to find that we're going to have to recalibrate some of the, some of our understanding. So the main sort of thesis in my presentation today is that Missouri is indigenous land, and we have sort of built our civilization on top of it. And I in no way want to try to speak for indigenous people. I am not an indigenous person, and I recognize that people who look like me have done lots of damage to the culture and to these people. And so I beg your forgiveness if I make any mistakes. And please just know that I'm trying to uncover and re-narrate sort of our understanding of this place and who lived here before us. And so next slide. So I'm going to start by talking about the namesake of our, oh no, I'm not going to start with that. This is from a book by Greg Olson, Indigenous Missouri, and I know we have a copy in the library, and if you've never read it, it's the book on indigenous people in Missouri, and it goes all the way back to 12,000 years ago. But what we call flyover country now was hotly debated and hotly pursued by European powers. The Spanish wanted this area, the French wanted it, the English wanted it. And we kind of think, as Midwesterners, we sort of have like it's just Midwest, I'm just from Missouri. But this is a highly desirable place. So the map next to the location of the indigenous tribes at the time of first contact, which I'll go over in a second, sort of indicates why Missouri is such a unique place. It's sort of the intersection of a transition of several different geographic zones. You have river lowlands, you have the upland Ozarks with forests, you have western plains, and then you have the whole north half of the state, which was dissected till plain. This sort of intersection creates great places for attracting animals. It also is a great place for farming. And since you're at the confluence of the Missouri, the Mississippi, and the Ohio, if you go a little bit further south, you're in what's called the American Bottom, which is some of the most fertile agricultural soil in the world and supported great numbers of people. So before 1673, it's kind of hard to tell where kind of people were, but 1673 is kind of our date. This is when Joliet and Marquette are coming down the Mississippi River, and even though it's sort of, the story's sort of told in a way that suggests that they're kind of intrepid, bold explorers, they had Peoria guides with them, and so they knew where they were. They knew what was around every single bend. It's not like they were, kind of off on their own. And so they would ask as they passed different rivers, who lives over here? And so at this time, the Illinois Confederacy would kind of go back and forth between Illinois and Missouri. The Chickasaws were into the southeast part of the state. The Quapaws were between, this is the, these are the Current, the Black, and the 11-Point rivers, I think. So the Quapaws were down in this area. By 1673, the Osage kind of splintered off into 3 groups. And so there's some in southwest Missouri, there's some up here in this great bend of the Missouri River, and then there's the Missouris, the Otos, and the Iowas. Many of these tribes were related. They spoke a different dialect of the same language. They had similar traditions and rituals. But this sort of establishes kind of where people were at that time. So the first thing that I would say in terms of our legacy is that we're named after a tribe, a Siouan tribe. And I asked my students the last couple of days, hey, where does Missouri get its name from? Some people had no idea, and some people had said, I had never really thought about it. But if you look at the map of the United States, you start on the East Coast and you see most of the places are like European names like New York and New Jersey. And the further west that you come, you start to see that the names of all the states begin to change, and these are all reflective of indigenous people who lived here before us. So the Missouris show up quite early. This is a 1732. This is a part of a map. It's in French, but you can see here we have Missouris are located right here. Usually they were on the north side of the Missouri River, and this is the little Osage there on the south side. So how do we get the name Missouri? As Joliet and Marquette are coming down the river, they have their Peoria. These are Illini people, and they ask them who lives here, and their response is Hue Missouret. And then that becomes anglicized into Missouri. And sort of an approximate translation would be people of the big canoes or people of wooden canoes. So on the Missouri River, you had to have a large dugout canoe. The waters were much more turbulent before it had been channelized. The Mississippi River and further north, you could get by on a bark canoe. But these were these large cottonwood trees that they had hollowed out and made into these large canoes. And not only that, but as Marquette and Joliet come down and they see the Missouri River emptying into the Mississippi, that if you look at the description, they describe it in horrific terms. They talk about water pouring over and trees getting pushed out, and then the muddy water sort of trying to mix in with the Mississippi. So if you've ever been to the confluence space, not only is that a beautiful site, it's also a sacred place for Native Americans, and you can clearly see how the Missouri River is really brown. The Missouri people didn't think of themselves as Missouris. They were Niutachi, And this means people of the river's mouth, and this refers to the fact that they probably lived around the mouth of the Grand River up here in central Missouri. Oftentimes the Algonquin word for muddy water, there's a typo, that's terrible, is Pecatinea, and that just means kind of muddy water. But the word Missouri refers to these people and to the river as well. And we'll take a look at the next slide. I put this one in here partly because I just love this painting, and I love the canoes. I like to canoe quite a bit. But so these are some quotes that I found from different people who were commenting on the Missouri people. The nation of the Missouris is very considerable and has given its name to the large river that empties into the Mississippi. It is the first nation we met with from the confluence of the two rivers. And this is from Antoine Simon Lepage de Pretz, which is an early Frenchman who was in the area. They were interested in the furs. Along this river and inland are several nations, such as the Iowa, the Oto, and the Imissouriette, where the buffaloes, which are found everywhere in Louisiana, come from. So I pause here for just a second because, I said, think about a 12,000-year history and think about a 250-year history. And in 250 years, we brought the bison almost to extinct. When Europeans came here, they were everywhere. Also, if you read Lewis and Clark's journals, they talk a lot about grizzly bears in Missouri. And they talk about how difficult it is to kill them because they're used to the black bears in the eastern part of the United States. And you could fire one shot and get rid of them. But these grizzly bears, they kept coming. And so I like to imagine, on a day like today, a beautiful day, we're driving down here, what would it have looked like to see bison and elk and deer and, heaven forbid, grizzly bears. William Clark in 1804 described the Missouri as one of the most numerous nations in this part of the continent. He even, as he's going up the Missouri River, he comes across a spot near Dalton, Missouri, and he says, this is an abandoned village of Missouria. And then the final one here is from 1700, the Louisiana territorial government estimated there were about 15,000 families of Missouri. This would have been a lot of people, and they made their presence widely known. Does anybody hear about the Missouria Indians today? Well, they're still here. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about what happened. You can't see this, but this is a panel from the Missouria village at the Utz Archaeological Site, which is the Van Meter State Park. If you've never been there, it's a great place to go and learn about all things Native American in Missouri. But if you can see, these are the lodges, and this is an artistic rendering of what a Missouri village would have looked like. And so if there were 1,500 families, I don't know how many people you think could live inside there, maybe 6, 7, 8. This means that there could have been anywhere between 7,000 and 10 or 15,000 people, which would have been a sizable population. I wanted to also give you a picture of a Missouri chief. This was painted by George Catlin, and you may be familiar with his paintings. He came to St. Louis in the 1830s. St. Louis was an international tourist hotspot in the 1830s and wealthy people from the East Coast came, as well as royal people from Europe, because they wanted to see Native Americans. And Catlin came because he wanted to paint them. And the idea was that this was sort of a vanishing race, and these people were sort of on the precipice of sort of disappearing. So people wanted to come and check it out and see it with their own eyes. So he paints this wonderful portrait of, Hachikigi Seguga, he who kills the Osages, which is a pretty cool name if you think about it. And I wanted to just point out a few things. You see the bear claw necklace that he's wearing? You couldn't just buy that at Walmart. He was probably a member of the Bear Clan, And the Missouri had kind of a cooperative government, which meant that half of the year the tribe was ruled by the head of the Bear Clan, and the other half by the leader of the Buffalo Clan. And so when I think about our current political milieu, and I wonder how we would do if we had to take turns every year, and maybe we get things done. Who knows? Maybe they were onto something. And then also I wanted to point out the pipe, the calumet. And so you can see the tip, that is that red stone. It's called calcinite, which is a sacred object to Native people, and it was largely found in Minnesota. Not only is the pipe kind of an artistic piece with the bear sculpted at the tip of it, but it was also an important tool used to create ties, used to establish relationships with people. So what happened to this great tribe? The next slide will tell us. In 1702, Father Marc Bergier wrote, "The Missouris are reduced to practically nothing." There's an Osage tribal memory that says, "Wallasukakas, little mystery people living inside the white man, caused many Missouri to sicken and die." And so between the time that Columbus touches the Caribbean and 1600, European diseases had probably killed between 75 and 80% of the native population. And this is because there was no natural immunity to things like influenza, chickenpox, smallpox, any of these types of diseases that Europeans had because they lived in close proximity to these critters. They didn't have those animals here. And so many of the Europeans, when they do come into the interior of the United States, they're looking at the remnants of a once populous group of people. They also noticed right away, too, that these vast open grasslands were clearly the result of the use of fire. And again, if I think about the 250 years of American fire policy, it has not worked out particularly well. We've tried to suppress, and every single year we have bigger and bigger forest fires. These were not stupid people. They knew how to manipulate the land, and they knew what was necessary to live off of it. So their numbers are dramatically reduced. By the time it's 1770, there's about 1,000 people, so their numbers have been cut anywhere from 70 to 80%. And then, next slide. This is from a travel memoir from Maximilian, Prince of Weed. I told you that there were fancy Europeans coming to this part of the country to see Native Americans. He's here, he takes a journey, and he describes a moment at which the Sac and Fox almost eradicate the Missouri nation as a whole. So our state is named for a tribe of people who were nearly annihilated by disease and then almost annihilated because of an intertribal warfare. And after this, they splintered off. So the majority of the Missouri joined the Otto because they did speak a common language. They were at one time probably one tribe, if you go back hundreds of years. And some of them joined with the Osage, and a few joined with the Iowa. And here's another, this is another print. This is a Missouri, this is a Ponca, this is a Ponca, and that's an Osage. But this Carl Bodmore, he was like a Swiss artist who was with this guy, the Prince of Weed. And he painted the picture of the Missouri, the Otto, and the Ponca near St. Joseph, Missouri, in about between 1833 and 1834. And this is just a really nice picture of like a person at that time period and how they dressed and kind of clothed themselves. So, as I mentioned before, the Missouri did not disappear. Our tribal namesake lives on. This is the official seal of the Missouri Otto tribe. They kind of became one. And there are 7 or 8 clans left. 2 of the clans have been extinct because the people ended up dying. And this was the original range of the Otos were kind of more in this area. And I remember as a small child that I thought, wow, I saw OTO on there. And I was like, I wonder if we're related to those people. But Obviously not. And then we're going to talk about them a little bit later, about this part of the area, this part of the state of Missouri. They were relocated to Red Rock, Oklahoma. The picture in the far right is a man named Truman Daly, and that's him at Disney's Frontierland. Did anybody go to Frontierland as a child? Well, he was a Missouri Indian, and he worked there. And some people thought, oh, well, isn't that kind of degrading to have to work with these annoying American tourists? And he said, no, I loved it. It was a chance for me to meet people and talk to people and to teach them, a more true and accurate portrait of Native Americans than what they would get on TV in the 50s and 60s, where you had like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, and Native Americans were really sort of depicted in a very limited light. He also was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Missouri because of his efforts to preserve the Missouri language. During the boarding school period in the 1890s and the early 1900s, it was U.S. policy to try to take the indigenous out of the person. And so they were punished for speaking their language. They were punished for, they cut their hair. They weren't allowed to dress in traditional clothing or worship or perform their rituals. And so there's a whole generation of indigenous people, Osage, Missouri, Otto, where they're kind of silent about their language and about their rituals. And so it's in the last 50 years that there's been a real concerted effort to reclaim the language, and it becomes more and more difficult with each passing year because there's fewer and fewer fluent speakers of the language and fewer people who have the cultural memory. So the state of Missouri is where we get our name. And the highest point in our state is Tom Sauk Mountain. Has anybody been there? You've never been there? You should go. And this is a Pinkashaw word, and it's supposedly named for Sauk Tonquay. And then just down, this is what it looks like right here. And this down from this is Minnesauk Falls. And this is where we get one of, I'm going to sort of veer off into another sort of aspect here, and that is these legends that grew up about these lovers' leaps, and I find these to be really fascinating. They're all over the place. So this one, if you've ever been to the top of Tom Sauk Mountain, right where the falls start, you would not want to fall down there. That would be bad. And supposedly, the daughter of Pinkashaw, they call her a princess, she falls in love with an Osage warrior. Her father won't allow it, and so over she goes. And so we'll take a look at the next slide. This is the Lover's Leap at Hahatonka State Park, which is part of the Lake of the Ozarks. There's another similar story. Usually the story goes like this. There's a woman from one tribe and falls in love with a man from another, and then an angry father refuses to allow the relationship, and then one or both of them jump over to die. This is another one. There's two at the Lake of the Ozarks. The other one on the far right is at Camdenton. And I always think it's kind of funny, like the Lake of the Ozarks is a result of damming the Osage River, which is named for probably the most powerful tribe in Missouri. The one in the bottom left, this is in Life on the Mississippi. If you read that by Mark Twain, he talks about, he says in that book that there was like 50 lovers' leaps up and down the Mississippi River. And this is the one that's outside of Hannibal. The one on the far right, I couldn't find a really good picture. This is a postcard from Creve Coeur Lake. If you've ever been to Creve Coeur Lake, I spent a lot of time there because my daughter plays soccer right across the street, and so does your daughter. And if you go back around there, there's a lover's leap story there, except for the story is slightly different. This one is the Native American woman falls in love with a French man, and again, her dad is not going to have it, and so she jumps over. I don't think you would die if you jumped over the lover's leap at the one in Creve Coeur. I think you could survive that one. There's one other story there's one other, I didn't have a picture of it. It's actually the one at Pierre Marquette. There's a lover's leap there. And the story behind that goes, an Osage princess is hanging out. She's sitting on the bluff across the Mississippi River, and she's dangling her feet over the edge. and a young, handsome man, an Indian man on the other side of the river, sees it. His name is Black Otter. And he jumps in the water and he swims across the entire Mississippi River and he courts her and they fall in love and they're going to have a wonderful life together. The father of the woman finds out and he dips his arrows in snake venom and then he's going to come and shoot the black otter to eliminate the threat to his daughter. Well, he misses and he hits his daughter. And at the moment he hits the daughter, she dies and falls right into his arms. And then at that moment, the black otter hears the sounds of a war party coming to finish the task, and he jumps with both of them over, and there's another lover's leap. So I find these things really interesting. It seems like this is an attempt to sort of project kind of European or mythology onto indigenous people. It's also sort of part of the sort of romantic storytelling of a tragic doomed race. It also has sort of hints of Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet. It's all really good stuff, but I doubt any of it really happens. Okay. Legacy. The Mississippi River is our Nile River. Cahokia and the mound complex that was built there is our Egypt. However, we don't seem to necessarily think of it like that or treat it as such. The picture in the far right-hand corner shows that there was a main city in what is now Cahokia, and then there were rings of suburbs. The first large suburb was outside of East St. Louis, so you can see that kind of at the bottom. And then across the river, the city of St. Louis was once known as Mound City. And there were so many mounds that people thought, let's call it Mound City. There's one mound left. I'm going to tell the story of that mound. But this is an artistic rendering of what the central plaza in Cahokia might have looked like. They built huge earthen temples or pyramids. If you've been to Cahokia, you realize walking up to the top of that platform, if you do it at a decent clip, you will be out of breath by the time you get to the top of it. And this was built by baskets filled with earth, tossed and scooped and tossed. And these huge borrow pits is what they're called that surround the terrace pyramid. They would use those, they then turned those into places where they would trap catfish in it, and then they would be able to get catfish right out of there. What fueled Cahokia was an agriculture. If you like corn, popcorn, you like to eat corn in the summertime, this is an indigenous food that was domesticated and given to Europeans, and it supported a population of between 15 and 20,000 people. At its peak, it was as big as London was in the year like 1100. And then by 1300, people began to leave. This is Monk's Mound. Monk's Mound gets its name because when some Trappist monks were coming down the river, they thought, hey, that mound looks like a good place to set up a camp and to live up here, and so it took that name. I'm going to go now to the next slide and share with you, this is a picture of a map of the distribution of mounds in the eastern United States produced by the Smithsonian Institute. So this was not an empty paradise waiting for people to take it. This was heavily, densely populated. These people managed the environment. These people had insight into the land and the relationship with nature. Next slide, please. And here are some early, this is a painting that I just focused on there's the biggest mound in St. Louis, and it was by the French, they called it an earthen barn. And it became, this is right, okay, where this is you know where the Stan Musial Bridge comes across? At the base of the footing of the Stan Musial Bridge, once it's on the Missouri side, that is where that mound was. And there were 40 to 50 mounds throughout the city of St. Louis. People debated, were they naturally occurring geologic formations? The people who inhabited St. Louis would not entertain the idea that these could have been built by the ancestors of the Indians that they had dealt with. In fact, they invented all kinds of strange stories. One theory was they were built by the Welsh. Another theory was that they were built by a lost tribe of Israel. Another theory was there was a previously advanced civilization that built these, and then they were killed off by the descendants of the contemporaneous native people who were surrounding them. And so this spawned lots of debate, and highly intelligent men would come to St. Louis and they would deliver papers on their theories about how the mounds got there and who built them and what their purpose was. The picture on the right is a close-up of an early map, and this is the central mound complex that would have included Big Mound. You can see they're in a circular shape, and researchers have also determined that these mounds were placed in a particular way to sort of accent different solar positions during the astronomical year. So at the certain times, the sun would appear to rise directly behind a particular mound. There was also a terrace. There was one spot I read in the Patricia Cleary's book on mound cities, really, really good. I highly recommend it. There was a picture, there was an imprint of a human foot, and a Catholic priest from Indiana thought that was so cool. He had it quarried out. He took it back to Indiana with him. But there's another picture here sort of celebrating Mound City. And you might still see remnants like on old buildings like Mound City Buggy. It was what would be called just at the tip of North St. Louis is where these things actually were. So what happened to them? Most of them there were a lot of different things. Some of the things where they took these mounds and they used them as water reservoirs early on. They sort of hollowed them out. Oftentimes there was lots of good sand and clay inside them, so people took the clay and made bricks, or they would take the sand and they would use it for other things. Big Mound, the last biggest mound in St. Louis, was actually destroyed to make way for the railroad. And they took the dirt and they used it to fill in on the sides of the railroad, so it was literally used for fill. This is the last mound, and I can recall as a kid driving north on 55, looking out my window to the right, and I saw this mound with a house sitting on top of it, and it always stuck in my head like, that is weird. And this is a terraced mound. It's called Sugarloaf Mound because apparently it resembled a sugar loaf, and there were three houses on it. And in 2009, I think it was 2009, the Osage bought it. They removed the houses, and they are going to turn it into an interpretive center. And this is kind of an example of a type of land back where indigenous people kind of are reclaiming their ancestral lands. There was the last woman lived, the house on the very top was built in the 20s. There were two others on the other side, a little bit lower. And this is from the Osage Nation homepage before they built the arch. We built the mounds, and I can't help but think I would rather have the mounds than the arch, but that's maybe just my preference. Okay? Hey, there were mounds in other places. How many of you have been to Gravois Bluff? You go to Walmart? There was a mound, a burial mound with dozens of bodies that were buried there. And in 1999, development wanted to come in, and we're going to build a Walmart here, and they started digging, and whoa, they found 2 burial mounds filled with about 100 skeletons of men, women, and children in varying states. There was also pottery. There were also artifacts. But this was really poorly handled. There's even a street in Fenton called Mound Street, and there's another sort of echo of indigenous presence. There's also a mound, the one on the far right it's a mound in O'Fallon, Missouri, and they have sort of cordoned it off, and there's some signage there. And there are signs out as far as Chesterfield as well. There was major archaeological work that was done kind of looking at those. But the one in Fenton is, it was sort of at the edge. This is not the mound. This is just a picture I found. I could not find any pictures. There's a good article by the Riverfront Times, and then there's a scientific article written by archaeologists, and he details all the different things that they found. Well, the biggest thing I thought that was really fascinating was there were no signs of diseases, but they did notice there was really bad dental issues that they were discovered in abscesses. So we'll take a look at the next slide. And what I wanted to try to kind of do here was to also point out that there was a cave in Warren County that went up this was on some property that was to be sold a few years back. And inside that cave, these are cave paintings that were sort of look like some of the imagery from the Piazza. You see the image on the rock wall in Alton, and this was a sort of a traditional creature that's probably like a link between the upper world and the lower world, and so it was kind of a scary thing. Usually if your boat went down in rapids, you might have thought that you were victim of the creature. And then there are these all these long-nosed creatures that are depicted in different types of ornamentation from the Cahokia area. And you see some images inside the cave of that as well. This is, according to Osage oral history, they were people who they were the builders of Cahokia. And when that civilization sort of dispersed, they just moved out into the surrounding area. And this is part of the reason what kind of helps them establish their claim to the Sugarloaf Mountain. Okay, other legacy. I said our civilization is built on top. This is a map that represents and outlines the major hunting and trading trails across the state of Missouri. And you should notice 44 is almost exactly in the exact same place. So Osage people, native indigenous people, would have used that trail to walk to St. Louis, to trade, to interact, to sell their products. Namely, the Osage, the water here, it's not cold enough to have the really thick beaver skins that were really in vogue in France and in Europe. And again, I was thinking about that last night. How many beavers had to die for some guy to wear a hat in France? The Osage produced the best deer skin, and the women were the best producers. They would have tanned the hide and stretched the hide, and then you bind them into bundles that weighed about 100 pounds, and you take them into St. Louis, and the French, the fur traders, would buy them. But from my just sort of naked eye here, I see a line between Springfield and St. Louis, which corresponds almost identically to I-44. And then this route was almost exactly as 61. And here is 55. So the roads that you walk on were once carved by indigenous people. And they were pretty good at finding the best line in a sort of a watershed so that you're not going up and down hills. And so it worked out pretty well for them. Okay, this is just one particular example of the Natchitoches Trail, which I thought was kind of interesting. And it may have even gone all the way into Mexico. And I just wanted to point this out, that it's sort of sad, but the Bengi route of the Trail of Tears actually followed this particular Native American trail. And I think that that's kind of ironic and terrible sort of a historical reality that the Cherokee people, and it wasn't just Cherokee. I did a thing a couple of years ago on the Potawatomi, the Shawnee, the Delaware. Every tribe has its own sort of Trail of Tears, and many of them went through Missouri on probably what were indigenous trails and traces that later became roads and highways. Agriculture, if you probably know about the three sisters, corn, bean, and squash. There's like I just learned about this. If you plant corn, it provides the scaffolding for the beans, and then the squash or the potato or the pumpkin with the spiky vines sort of acts as a deterrent to other critters, and the gourds or the pumpkins sort of shade and trap the moisture underneath, and so it's an ingenious multi-crop sort of process. And I didn't go into great depth on this, but I found several articles that talked about how contemporary agriculture is looking back to indigenous people to try to figure out how can we do this without using so many pesticides and herbicides, and how can we reshape agriculture in a more sustainable way. The Osage, the Missouri, the Otto, many native people are reintroducing bison and buffalo to their lands. They realize that the buffalo are a keystone species for prairie habitat. So just one little example, when the buffalo lie down and they roll around, they create what's called a buffalo wallow. And those wallows are a really important habitat for when it does rain in the spring. You get these sort of small pools of water that support frogs and salamanders and different insects, which are necessary for the overall health of the prairie as well. And I won't even go into the tall grass and how far down the roots go and what happens when you dig that up, but I'll let the biologists talk about how bad that is for topsoil, and how probably 50% of the soil in the Great Plains, maybe even more than that, has been completely lost. And so the disking and the plowing has done a great deal of damage to the long-term viability of agriculture in that location. This is a picture of Tower Grove Park, and this is a creek that when they built Tower Grove Park, they covered it and they put a pipe in the ground. And the Osage came back and they said, we can do this. And they took the cover off, they took the pipe out, and they put they revived or revived a creek that had been destroyed. And I thought that was kind of interesting because it's sort of like right kind of in our backyard. I mean, we could talk more and more about Native people and their legacy, but the main thing that I want to say is that they're still here and they're coming back, and they're doing projects like Sugarloaf and reviving creeks in places like Tower Grove. And all of these are, and they're also influencing different groups of farmers to rethink how we do agriculture. And all of these things, I think, are positive for everyone involved. And so my conclusion, the only other thing is I'm going to say this, and this is because I have a student, her name is Kaylee Charbonneau, and she's in an online class. And I met her today just by accident. And Charbonneau was Toussaint Charbonneau was the husband of Sacagawea, the guide that went with Lewis and Clark. I started talking to her, and I was like, do you know your last name? You know, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau was their son, that Sacagawea did the whole Lewis and Clark with an infant, which I think that is oftentimes overlooked. He was baptized at the old cathedral, and I said, tell me about your family. And she said, oh yeah, my great-great-grandmother was a full-blooded Blackfoot Indian, and I'm from Potosi. And I was like, you need to look into your history. And then I also have a student, Ryan Parks, who's here with us, and I realized I left out probably the most important legacy, and that's people. People, they're still here, their descendants are still here, and they're among us. And so my conclusion is anywhere you go, you're on Indian land. And I think that we can learn a lot. And in this really divided political time, I think about how are we supposed to make any sort of decisions or choices or come together if we can't agree on what happened in the past. And so I just hope that this gives you something to think about and maybe talk about, and maybe do your own reading and find out more about the people who were here before us, because they left us a rich treasure trove of ideas and places and art and structures. And with that, I will thank you. Does anybody want to ask questions?
So, the people that are still here, does anybody have like a name of, modern name or old name of related to like people who are from, tribes from Missouri? Like, they may go around some say we're Missouri.
Yeah, they joined the Oto, so there's the Missouri Oto, but there's still, there's tens of thousands of Osage people. They're spread out around Oklahoma. They're here. They're living in different places. All the different tribes that I showed you on that early map, the Illini, the Quapaw, Chickasaw, Osage, Oto, Missouri, and Iowa, they all still exist, and they all still use their same tribal names. Yes, sir.
Goes to whatever industry. A lot of times you said oral history.
Oh, oral history?
Yes.
Yeah.
With that, is there any sort of like documentation of history before settlers that got you?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the difficult thing for people who try to study history. You have to look. They didn't write anything down. They're an oral culture, so all of their information would be passed on through word of mouth, through stories, and so it's hard to sort of nail that down. You can look at the artwork, and then scholars do go and talk to Native people and look at their stories, and then compare them to other stories, and there's lots of stories about different places and locations, but then you can start to see patterns by comparing them with other ones. But as far as documentation, that's really kind of the hard part. It's only when Europeans come and start writing things down that you get things kind of written down in that real. There's other ways of sort of keeping track. There's also an indigenous tradition of using hides and sort of drawing stories and sort of preserving history that way. Through the art and through the stories, but it's not like in a kind of like a journal or a diary as we would sort of imagine or maybe like it to be. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
You said that Grandwood Bluffs, the mounds were burial mounds. Is that what the majority of them were, or were they used for?
Oh yeah, they're used for different things. Many of them were burial mounds, and some of them were just sort of ceremonial places where maybe you'd have a ritual, or maybe you built the mound because you wanted the sun to rise or set directly over it for sort of a ritual or for a religious experience. There's been maybe some people thought maybe they were used as to communicate, to signal from one place to another. And they would have been, many of that large flat mound in Cahokia, Monk's Mound, the elite people of the community lived on it, so they were homes. But many of them were used for burials. And I can show you the articles if you want. There's one in the Riverfront Time that really looks at the politics of why didn't the state step in to try to slow it down, and gets into the engineering company that was behind sort of the bulldozing and building of the thing. Illinois has much stricter laws when it comes to any kind of disturbing of a burial site. It's much more closer with the federal guidelines, and Missouri doesn't have very strict guidelines. The other thing I would say about mounds is that I showed you that map from the Smithsonian with all those red dots. many of the mounds in Missouri are on private land, and so there's, just people have them in their, on their property, and there's not really any kind of, archaeology or that kind
So
of
they
thing.
would build them and then they would live there for a period of time before they moved on or stayed?
Well, it seems like there was something that brought all these people together, like between 900 and by 1100 or so. It seems like that was the maximum occupation. That was when it was at its biggest. And then there's all kinds of research and history. Well, why did people decide to leave this area? And everything from, if you take 10 to 15,000 or 20,000 people and put them all in that one area, and every family has a fire, it would have been really smoky, and you would have to walk further and further and further every day to get firewood. Also, you have to think that because there was this strict sort of social stratification, that you had people who lived on top of a mound, then everybody else is out here. Everybody else might have said, we don't like doing this anymore. And there's some evidence that there may have been some kind of clash to that degree, because they find wooden palisades, like walls, to try to keep people away. Also, if you bring this many people together, you're going to have a lot of hunters who are, really scaling up the hunting just to feed everybody, even more so, or probably not as much as the commercial hunting that the indigenous people did to trade with French people. But there's that. There's also some suggestion that maybe there were problems with water, there was flooding, there was disease. It just didn't. But the idea is, it's not like these people just all died off. They just moved out into other areas and sort of adopted a different sort of style of life. They took, the agricultural practices, and then they moved them out. So the Osage were essentially, and the Missouri, all of those tribes were like semi-sedentary. They had like a main home base, and then 2 to 3 times a year, they would go off on big hunting parties. So they would go to the Ozarks, and they would hunt deer and bear, and then they would go west onto the plains for their bison hunts, and then they would come back. So I don't know I think does that answer your question? Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know what happened to everything they uncovered and they did find that
All the bodies were, so once they started to find the bodies, the engineering company that was responsible for, the planning and the construction, they were sort of like, look, we are not going to hire archaeologists, and they didn't want to pay to bring in experts to sort of sort through everything. So they took some of the skeletons, by the way, were so old that as soon as somebody touched them, they turned into powder. But the ones that were still salvageable, they put them into these special tanks and just hid them. And they were waiting for the state of Missouri, the Department of Natural Resources. They're the ones who are supposed to come in and sort of catalog, and they bring in the archaeologists. And that eventually happened, but it was after several years. I think that the construction of the site began in like 1998 or 1999, and then it was completed shortly thereafter. But the skeletons and much of the non-skeletal remains were just plowed out of the way. So, yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
the house that's south 55 that was on the mountain? Where exactly is that at?
Okay, so it's once you know how like 55 sort of curves around there, and then you like look and like Broadway's right over here. So it's pretty much right there. If you go into your computer and type in Sugarloaf Mountain, you can get the exact address. I think it's at Ohio Street, as I recall. But I remember driving up there, and you can look out and you can see the river, and there's that.
I grew up down there.
Did you?
I'm trying to picture it as a child.
Okay, yeah, type in Sugarloaf Mountain. It'll show you exactly where it is. And I'm excited for the Osage to turn that into an interpretive center, and I think that'll be great for us. Anybody else? Thank you so much for coming on this great day, and I appreciate your time.